Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. The International Crimes Tribunal in Bangladesh has launched 3 mass murder probes against former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina after the weeks of massive and violent protests that overthrew her government during student-led protests against job quotas, which actually favored Sheikh Hasina's supporters. More than 450 people have been reportedly killed as the government faced those protesters with a violent crackdown. Now the United Nations Human Rights Office says, let me quote, there are strong indications of warranting further investigation that the security forces used unnecessary and disproportionate force in the response to the situation, unquote. Now this particular International Crimes Tribunal that we are talking about, that has launched 3 mass murder probes against the former Prime Minister, was set up back in 2010 by herself. And this particular tribunal has sentenced more than 100 people to death, mostly the political opponents of former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. Now, Sheikh Hasina called the protesters during this particular wave of protests back in July and August as terrorists, while the protesters had been chanting, let me quote, 1, 2, 3, 4, Sheikh Hasina is a dictator. Her government has been also accused of massive human rights abuses, including the extrajudicial killings. Also, interestingly, after she went into exile to India after her government was overthrown, she has demanded a probe into the killings and the vandalism during these protests. After a case was also taken up by a court of a death of a grocery shop owner during the protests. Also, in another major development, we have seen Indian Prime Minister Modi and head of Bangladesh's transitional government, Mohammad Yunus, have talked. Will also be taking the analysis as to what could be the future course of the bilateral relationship between Bangladesh and India. Also taking the analysis of India's role during the long rule of Sheikh Hasina, which has been termed as authoritarian by the opposition. Let me quickly bring in, we are honored to have been joined in the studio by Mr. Jauhar Saleem. He is serving currently as President of Institute of Regional Studies in Islamabad and has also served as former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan. Mr. Saleem, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on the show tonight. Really appreciate that. Also in the studio, we are honored to have been joined by Dr. Manzoor Afridi. He is foreign affairs expert. Dr. Afridi, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on the show tonight. Really appreciate that. Mr. Saleem, let's begin with the very basics. This overthrow of the government, this was a 5th term for Sheikh Hasina. So that shows that her grip over there was quite firm. So what actually led to these massive protests that ultimately led to the overthrow of her government?
Yes. We have to recall that she had been in power since 2009. And she won an elections which were probably not as controversial. But in subsequent elections, there were a series of elections where she incarcerated her political opponents. Though in those elections, she did not allow her political opponents to contest on a level playing field. In fact, some of those elections were totally boycotted by the main opposition party, BNP, Khaleda Zia's. And Khaleda Zia was jailed. And then using the sort of the usual tactics, like harassing, incarcerating the opponents, using the power of state against the political opponents in all possible ways, she turned into some sort of a civilian dictator. In fact, the last several elections had been very controversial, but despite the fact that the international community did not believe the elections were fair, or there was a level playing field for all the political parties, they still allowed her that sort of the freedom of sort of being accepted or recognized as the Prime Minister, because there's so many international issues going on. Nobody wanted another issue. in a big country in terms of population, such as Bangladesh. Then India had been backing Hasina very, very fervently over the years, because in Bangladesh there has been a clear divide. Hasina Wajid, because of her lineage as well, she had a very sort of, like biased leaning towards for India and against Pakistan over the years. So in fact, since 1990s, what we had seen when these two ladies were in power for the first decade or half, almost like alternately, that whenever Hasina Wajid was in power, Bangladesh would become really close to India, almost a client state of India. But when Khaleda Zia was in power, the country had a more balanced foreign policy and a more balanced interstate relations. So that had been going on. But eventually, I think she went too far in terms of creating that cult of personality, creating that the whole propaganda in terms of what happened in 1971, and sort of, and then the supporters that she had, she had been sort of, like promoting her supporters, her sort of, side of political divide in so many ways. And when she tried eventually to come up with these job quotas for the sort of, for the relatives of what she termed as the 1971 heroes, people who supported their cause, I think that was like the proverbial last straw on the camel's back, and then the students revolted. These protests had been going on since June, we have to recall. Initially, these were totally non-violent, but then when the Hasina-led government tried to crush them by brute force, then they turned violent. And first we saw a situation where 100 students got killed, and then in subsequent waves, eventually over 400 students got killed, and that is the time when the military also intervened in terms of giving the ultimatum to Hasina Wajid, and then of course she fled. But what we have seen since then, that this Nobel laureate, like Prime Minister, who was renowned in the world for this Grameen Bank movement of microfinance, which has transformed Bangladesh in many ways. Dr. Mohammed Yunus, because this Grameen Bank over the years gave loans, microfinance loans worth $34 billion to over 10 million people. And that really transformed Bangladesh in many ways, particularly in terms of women empowerment. But what we have seen since is that there have been still some unrest going on. In fact, another couple of hundred students have been, or deaths have taken place since then. And we saw the change in terms of the advisor of Home Affairs, Brigadier Sakhawat, being replaced by Lieutenant General, retired General Jahangir Alam. So that is still there. The Indians are, because they have, first of all, Hasina Wajid absconded to India, and where she was received by Ajit Doval. And now that's very interesting, because Ajit Doval, for a long time, was the head of RAW, and even now he's a national security advisor, and RAW still operates under him. And we know that he has this policy of offensive defense against Pakistan, and he's been, he's been involved in all types of sort of, these policies within the region. One of which was to dominate, one of those projects was to dominate Bangladesh's politics and to ensure that Bangladesh became and stayed as a client state of India, as in some ways a satellite state of India, if they had managed that.
So this overthrow of the government of Sheikh Hasina, how bigger a setback do you think it is for the Indian authorities? I'll come back to you. Let me bring in Dr. Manzoor Afridi also. Dr. Manzoor Afridi, this overthrow of the government, the fifth term by Sheikh Hasina, that speaks volumes, the kind of grip she had got into the political mainstream over there in Bangladesh. So get this particular government being overthrown, these massive student protests, the kind of resentment that we have witnessed, the entire world has witnessed, did it happen overnight or just within a span of a couple of months, or was it brewing since long time?
That is the long process. It was over there in Bangladesh, students and other sectors of life, you know, they were having so many problems, and like the political opposition, like the unrest in Bangladesh, like sending people jails without any allegation or putting them under some severe allegations, and the most important, that is the unemployment, and also this, the last one we can say, the quota problem, the issue, it was raised by the Bangladeshi students that they were asking for the merit-based allocation, not for the quotas, which Sheikh Hasina was favoring their own loyals on these quotas. So it was the problem. I think it was already there in the Bangladesh domestic politics, in the Bangladesh society. So people, they were not happy with the policies of Sheikh Hasina. They were waiting for the reforms, but Sheikh Hasina's government was not flexible in this regard. So for the last few months, then this thing became very much evident, especially after coming into power of Sheikh Hasina. And the parliamentary elections when they were held. So I think it is the thing, or it is the point where the protesters, they got an opportunity, because main opposition parties, they were not allowed to contest elections, or they boycotted the election. And even these elections, these were not very much fair. And according to many reports, what I have gone through, there was Indian involvement, there was the Indian secret agencies sabotaging these elections, and they were favoring Sheikh Hasina to win these elections. So it was the thing where protesters...
The United States at that particular time had also raised the objections as to the fairness of those elections.
Yeah, very much true. And it was also reported in the New York Times and the other dailies of the United States. So it was the point where the protesters, especially the students, they launched their strike, their protests, and the intensity came especially in the June, right, in the last 2 months, and then they announced their Dhaka March, right. So when the situation, it was uncontrollable for Sheikh Hasina, then she started, crackdown, and at last she fled to India.
So what was the tipping point? What was the tipping point that actually led to finally the overthrow of her government? Was it the massive or brute use of force, the deployment of the army over there against the protesters?
Two things are important in this regard. One, the already persistent demands of the protesters, what I explained, especially the employment issue, especially the quotas in the government jobs. This was the issue. And the second, when protesters they faced the brutal force, I mean, have the Sheikh Hasina government used police or other paramilitary forces against the protesters. So it was the thing which ignited these protests and turned them into more violent, the countrywide protests. So then it was, I think, very much out of control for Sheikh Hasina.
So was there an alternate way or a strategy that could have been deployed to deal with these protests, other than using the force or the deployment of army?
Yes, there was. For example, negotiations, that was the way. For any problem, for any issue, even big wars, those have been resolved with negotiations. These were the own Sheikh Hasina's people, the Bangladeshi. They were Bangladeshi.
But she had been calling them as terrorists.
They were calling them even Razakar and terrorists.
So does that show that she had no intention at all to resolve this matter through other means or peaceful means? Rather, she was adamant of cracking down with brute force on those protesters.
Exactly. That is the point. What she was not ready for. Negotiations, that was the solution. Reforms, to bring reforms within her policies, it was the solution. to all parties conference under the patronage of Sheikh Hasina, I mean the Awami League, to reach to a concrete solution to have a consensus to build about the Bangladesh, all these issues. It was I mean the solution. So there were a lot of ways, but Sheikh Hasina's government was not ready, for all these reforms. So if these reforms were held, then of course there were some other issues that protesters might raise them, like the extrajudicial killings, like the forced disappearance of the people.
I'll talk about those issues also. Let me once again go back to Mr. Saleem. Mr. Saleem, when we talk about these protests over the government job quotas, now that job quota, specifically when we talk about it, how discriminatory that was? What were the major contours of that job quota that pushed people to come out in the streets in a massive number?
Yeah, there was no basis for that job quota, because that job quota supposedly was for what she termed as, or her party termed as, the heroes of 1971 war, people who basically rebelled against Pakistan, and their families. So they were giving them 30% quota. Now, 71 is a long time back, whatever happened then. And just imagine that the families were getting quotas like literally after sort of, 50 or more years later. The actual intent was to basically reward, the sympathizers of her ideology, people from her party, and basically because this was just a garb for that. And the students could see through that. And already, if the employment opportunities are limited. Although we have to remember that Bangladesh had economically done pretty well during these last 15 years. But the reason for that was not perhaps the policies that she had implemented. There are other reasons for that. The Bangladesh textile industry, particularly the garment industry, had done very well over the years, and it is about 85% of their $55 billion trade of exports that they have. But the fact is that, okay, look, this became just a sort of, like a trigger. We all know that. The trigger can be anything. For the Arab Spring, just one person's, burning himself became a trigger. So it's not about the trigger, it's about the root causes of the problem. So the root causes of this whole saga was that she was an illegitimate ruler. For the last many elections, she had been supposedly winning the elections through fraudulent proceedings, through just alienating, through excluding all political opponents. So this was not pluralism, this was not democracy. And I think eventually the people revolted against that. And eventually people revolted against the ideology that he stood for. Mm-hmm. Because what did she stand for? She stood for an ideology of hate. An ideology of hate against who? Hate against Pakistan, unfortunately.
So under her role, when there was victimization so rampant, she had been following the fraudulent means to come into power and have that grip on it. So you already talked about when Khalida Zia and Sheikh Hasina had alternate terms. So you described about the difference of the foreign policy under both of them. What about when those people who actually belonged to the opposition were victimized under Sheikh Hasina's term? Was there any vengeance on the part of Khalida Zia's political party when it came to power?
No, Khalida Zia never went to that extent. This type of brutality, literally, that was witnessed in the last 15 years, this type of incarceration was not witnessed during her term, because although at that time she did come into power, a couple of times. The second thing is, there are three points here. One is this victimization, this this illegitimacy. That is one thing. And the fact that it was not pluralism or democracy. The other is the ideology she stood for, as I mentioned, an ideology of hate, an ideology of they against us, a divisive ideology that she stood for, And the third thing is her very, very sort of, this puppet-like stance on India. People didn't like that in Bangladesh because Bangladeshi people are proud people. They wanted an independent country with an independent foreign policy, which would not be a client state of any bigger power. And there's a there's a huge majority in Bangladesh which would not stand for that. Okay, but for some time, and Bangladesh, Indians were involved in.
So Bangladesh being the puppet of Indians, what advantages or the benefits Indian being getting because of Sheikh Hasina?
India had considered Bangladesh a project, literally, and they thought it was a triumph for their foreign policy. It was a triumph for their intelligence agencies that they were literally able to create a client state, or at least a state which was dominated by them, and they had been able to wean it away from from any sort of type of relations with Pakistan, and I think they had worked on that very much, and they had been working on that. They had been making a lot of investments. Hasina did try to have some sort of relations with China as well, but wherever we saw the very many instances, wherever it was between India and China, any particular contract or any particular project, it would always go to India. So that is again people, Bangladeshi people, Bangladeshi businessmen, they're entrepreneurs, they're intellectuals, they're intelligentsia. They did not appreciate that, and this was simmering. This had been simmering for a while. In fact, a lot of people were just wondering what was going on because election after election, she was doing that.
So, so Mr. Saleem, you already talked about the economic growth Bangladesh witnessed under her rule. Yeah. Many reports suggesting that the GDP growth rate standing at 7.2%. So, isn't that phenomenal? So, what were the reasons behind if she had usurped power through fraudulent means? Would naturally try to think what was the reason of that economic growth of 7.2%?
You see, we have witnessed this phenomenon many times in history. When you have dictatorships, whether they are civilian dictatorships, we have to remember even Hitler's was a civilian dictatorship. He came as a democratically elected chancellor. Then he established a civilian, and during his time, Germany initially they had unimaginable growth. Stalin, Stalin was able to just literally have the type of economic growth that in countries in the West would marvel at. So this happens.
What we understand from this is that any economic growth under a dictatorship or an authoritarian rule is just a bubble, just to be burst.
It is not sustainable in the long run.
In the long
because
run,
in the longer run, an economic growth and economic development has to be rooted in the will of the people. And if you don't do that, then for a short burst of time, which could last sometimes 5, 10, 15 years, you could have phenomenal growth, but eventually it will all explode, unfortunately.
Because of the lack of the inclusive economic institutions, am I correct?
Because of the lack of inclusiveness, because of the lack of legitimacy, because of the lack of the exercise of the will of the people. And that is why democracies, the type of economic development and growth that they have witnessed, it is much more sustainable. It can go on for centuries, literally, as we have seen, in the many Western countries. Or, if you have systems where where people think they have stakes, then it works, like China. But if you establish a civilian dictatorship just with brute force and the support of a neighbor, then that system would be inherently unstable.
Right. Dr. Afridi, now, how big is it a setback for Indians, this overthrow of Sheikh Hasina's government? And where do you foresee how India would be strategizing at this particular point in history?
A huge effect it will have on the India-Bangladesh relations. Indeed, India is not happy with this development. Why? Because of so many factors. The first one, that is the economics. The trade relationship between India and Bangladesh, that is excellent, I can say. Nowadays, almost 16 billion US dollars, that is the trade annual volume between the two states. So first setback, it is for the economic relationship between the two countries. Second, that is the China card, China factor. India is already very much concerned about the China's growing influence in South Asia, whether that is in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Sri Lanka, in Maldives, in Bhutan, in Nepal, everywhere. But especially it is concerned with Bangladesh, because Sheikh Hasina was trying, also to accommodate China to some extent, because she could not ignore the China's growing influence like the other states. So India was not very happy. Now, after this development, there will be more chances for China to invest in Bangladesh, to have more stronger relations between Beijing and Dhaka, and that is unbearable for India. The third factor, that is Pakistan. Even according to the Indian media, these protests, as they say, that they were, pro-Pakistan, or Pakistan was, behind these protests like that. If you see, the Indian media, both the electronic as well as the press. So now they are afraid that this interim government, or later on another government, that will be pro-Pakistan. So it will neglect India, or the Indian influence in Bangladesh, that will be minimized. Another thing, that is the border security. India is very much concerned on its border security with Bangladesh, because India shares the longest border with Bangladesh as compared to other South Asian countries. It is 4,096.1 square kilometer, kilometer with Bangladesh. So it is, very much long. Another thing, that is also a kind of porous border between the two states. So in the history we have seen, when there were problems in Bangladesh, many Bengalis, they crossed the border, and there were even skirmishes, there was the illegal immigration across the border. So again, India is concerned about these, how to solve this problem. There were, even in the Sheikh Hasina's period, there were negotiations between the border security force of India and the border safeguards of Bangladesh, right? So this is
when you talk about an impact on the economic relation between India and Bangladesh, so more room for Chinese investment.
More room
For Chinese investment. But other than that, how it is going to be impacted under the new government, or under this particular transitional government? Is there going to be any sort of a revision of those agreements between India and Bangladesh? Do you foresee that?
Possible, because it was the Awami League who signed the 20 years friendship treaty with India after the creation of Bangladesh. It was Sheikh Mujibur Rahman who signed it. And when Sheikh Hasina came into Bangladesh politics after exile in the start of 1980s, she was very much happy about this agreement, and she wanted to continue it. And we have seen in the 2 decades long rule of the Sheikh Hasina that how she was signing agreements with India. And in the last 5 years, in the last tenure, what we have came across, that is that Sheikh Hasina also was too much dependent on the defense sector of India. And Modi government was also very much willing to help Hasina's government in defense sector. Let me tell you that in the 8 years, India gave $8 billion loan to Sheikh Hasina's government, right? So that was also the point that the people of Bangladesh, they were not happy that Bangladesh was going to have more and more client state of India. I think those agreements can be revised, can be reviewed, very much possible if the anti, anti-Hasina or anti-Awami League parties, they win the elections. If in near future there will be
Let me take this
parliamentary
point to
elections.
Mr. Saleem. How do you think the bilateral economic relation between India and Bangladesh is going to be affected under the new government when and if it comes after the transitional government?
Well, first of all, we'll have to see what is the outcome of the elections. For the time being, it seems that there's a huge anti-Hasina wave in Bangladesh, and because of that, the election outcome could be very much against her party. So if that happens, then we could see a more balanced Bangladesh economic policy in terms of relations with their major neighbors, that is India and China. So probably we'll see a more balance in trade as well. For the time being, it's predominantly in favor of India. Then in terms of projects as well, we might see a more equitable sort of distribution of projects in terms of companies from China and India. Also, I think it will allow Bangladesh to have more balanced relations with other countries in South Asia. Right now, as we speak, the Secretary General of SAARC is a Bangladeshi. In fact, he visited Pakistan recently. He came to our institute as well and spoke there. So there could be endeavors towards more regional cooperation, but a more balanced one, not one which is just tilted towards India. So that is there. But I think the more important facet would be in terms of political relations. And that is where we could see a massive change. Because during Hasina's this long tenure, what we saw was that Bangladesh was literally like, they had become some sort of at least the Indians were treating them as some sort of a vassal state. And their foreign policy was primarily towing the Indian line. And, and particularly when it came to Pakistan, it was just propaganda. I can tell you instances where, as ambassador to Germany and Italy, I saw in the National Day receptions that they would have there, and generally we had good relations with the Bangladeshi ambassadors, but they would be distributing those pamphlets and and sort of video material about so-called genocide in '71 and all those propaganda at every reception. The embassies abroad were asked by Hasina government to do that consistently. That propaganda was not just within Bangladesh; it was without or outside as well, everywhere in the world. And why she was doing it? Because of two reasons. One was, of course, to cement the legacy of Sheikh Mujib, and to sort of and through that hate and divisiveness, strengthen her constituency in Bangladesh. But secondly, also to please India, because Indians were asking them to do that. Now that will change, because a government which would be headed by, let's say, which seems likely at this point, unless there's some major sort of upset by BNP in the next elections, possibly. If that happens, or if even there's some other party or a coalition that is much more, that is likely to have to adopt policies with a much more nuanced and balanced relations of Bangladesh with India and with Pakistan, as it should be.
Is it because of these reasons that you have just elaborated quite in detail, very comprehensively, that the Indian media, right after this overthrow of the government of Sheikh Hasina, started pointing fingers towards Pakistan, as Dr. Manzoor Afridi has also alluded to?
Yeah, it's very interesting because I've been sort of seeing the Indian newspapers and their stories post, 5th August. And what they're doing is, first of all, they started maligning America. It's very interesting. They said,
I beg your pardon. One of those shows I remember is that he was talking about the trio.
Yeah.
So Pakistan, Jamaat-e-Islami over there in Bangladesh, and the United States of America.
Yeah.
All of these three joining hands.
Exactly. They came up with strange conspiracy theories. Now, the first theory was
one of the leading anchors.
Exactly. Many of them were doing that. The newspapers were doing that. All the mainstream newspapers, whether it was Hindustan Times or Express and all that, sort of, or India Today, stories emphasizing that it was basically or proposing a conspiracy that the CIA did that. Why? Because Americans wanted a base in Bangladesh, which apparently India was opposed to. Now this is totally funny. You know why? Because we know how much like India is involved in the so-called US Indo-Pacific strategy, and how close the relations between the US and India are presently. And in this type of a situation, Americans doing that would be just unthinkable. The second theory was there was Pakistanis which had been involved before as well, and they were propping up the sort of the opposition and perhaps the influencing the army. Again, ludicrous theory. Pakistan had no footprint in Bangladesh of that kind, where they could have even if they had wanted, and Pakistan never wanted that. And then of course those are the theories that it was because and now they've been projecting that in India, that this whole thing is anti-minorities. Who are the minorities? The Hindus. They're the big sort of Hindu minority in Bangladesh, and other minorities as well. Again, that is a fallacious theory. That's not the case. The fact is that she, and Hasina in particular, is still not feeling, and she's still talking about inquiring the facts of what happened, and why it happened, and and still terming those student protests as violent acts by terrorists or whatever. So I think she's still living in a world of fantasy of her own, because she cannot digest that what has happened. But the fact remains that this was bound to happen at some point. Because you cannot really continue with this type of a civilian dictatorship forever when the people have turned against you, and you can't one after another. You can't keep on defrauding the will of the populace and overturning the will of the people.
Right.
So I think now what we'll see is most probably a Bangladesh, which although we have to say that the situation remains fragile and delicate, but as the things stabilize, we will see a Bangladesh which would be less divisive, which would be less hate mongering, and where you would probably see a government more representative of the will of the people.
Right, Mr. Saleem. Now, do we understand this particular phenomenon has taken place, that what goes around comes around? Is this the tribunal that has launched these mass murder probes, 3 mass murder probes against Sheikh Hasina? She set this particular tribunal up back in 2010. Now that particular tribunal has opened these mass murder charges against her. How do you look? What could be the potential outcomes of this particular probe?
Yes, I think as you've rightly said, sometimes
what goes around comes around.
Exactly, and they say that the chicken have come home to roost now. Sometimes if you dig holes for others, then you could get trapped there, yourself. So that is happening to her. She had been using all these tactics, to incarcerate the opposition, and now the same institutions or the same tools that she built for that very purpose could be very well become her nemesis. And this has been again seen in history many times. We have seen this phenomenon repeating itself. But unfortunately, politicians or these type of...
They don't learn from history.
They don't learn from history.
That is exactly what happened in the French Revolution, also the reign of terror.
Yeah.
Dr. Manzoor Afridi, what's your understanding? What could be the potential outcome of this particular probe by this International Crimes Tribunal, which was, of course, set up by Sheikh Hasina herself?
The Bangladesh people, they are welcoming it, no doubt. Majority of the people and population, international community, that is also welcoming it, and it will give a kind of relief to the Bangladesh people. It will have a kind of, we can say, to cure all those damages what Sheikh Hasina has done.
So what do you expect out of this probe? The United Nations statement, which I've already mentioned, it also includes a part that talks about those abuses, including alleged violations, including extrajudicial killings, arbitrary arrests, detention and forced disappearances, torture and ill treatment.
Yeah, all these things very much true.
Is
These
there
are the
any
facts.
sort of a role the UN can play in this particular probe?
It can just
Because the head of the transitional government has assured the UN that they will be giving them the support whenever and whatever is required.
yeah, possible. United Nations can motivate it more. Already now the head of the interim government, he is the Nobel laureate. He has the international acceptance in this regard. He has good relationship with the international community, with the United Nations agencies. So in this regard, we can say a kind of bond it can be developed, right? The facilitation, the support from the international community, especially the United Nations, it can come more, forward for this case, to probe all these investigations and to carry on this process in a smooth and a transparent way. But I think it can be also a lesson for all the politicians, especially inside Bangladesh, to be very much, careful about playing the politics, about to play with the sentiments of the people, to have more democratic in the nature, to have good governance in their respective governments in future. So it can be good initiative, and I
give
think
heed to what the people in general are saying. Dr. Manzoor Afridi, Foreign Affairs expert, thank you very much for being with us on the show tonight. Really appreciate that. Mr. Jauhar Saleem, a former Foreign Secretary and President, Institute of Regional Studies, thank you very much for your time also for being with us on the show tonight. Really appreciate that. With that, we come to the end of today's episode. Till the next one, take good care of yourselves.